Start the YouTube. I'll start here in Zoom.
All right, here it goes.
One minute. I want to say welcome everybody. We're here for another week, and I feel like we are making some progress. So we want to start the meeting, and I'm going to post the agenda in the chat so everybody can see it. So there won't be a slide, but take a minute to look at the chat right now, and that will be today's agenda. Philip will not be here, so I will be here solo. But that's today's agenda. We want to start by approving the minutes from the March 29th meeting. So I believe a poll will go out, and please take a note to approve the previous minutes. You should have received an email. If for some reason there's a discrepancy there, feel free to write it in the chat. And we'll wait 30 seconds or a minute to get everybody in there. Group T, how many people are logged on?
We've got 23 participants logged on.
Okay.
And then I think in really 19, because I think we've got some people in host roles. So
Right.
About half the group. We've got about 12 responses so far. Maybe just confirming that everyone should be seeing a poll here. Okay.
So we have 15 of the 23 now.
Correct.
So we'll pass, and so the minutes are approved. Again, if for some reason we find a discrepancy, please let us know. And I would want to go to announcements. I know the Kira team does not have any announcements. That is correct?
That's correct.
And then I would move to Councilmember Tolbert. Any announcement about where the council is today? And then I was going to put in the chat some information about the communication period about leaving comments regarding rent stabilization. So Councilman Tolbert, do you have any updates? So Councilmember Tolbert may not be online here. I just wanted to let everyone know there is 2 links, and it does not have to do with necessarily this group, but it is open for comment in the city. So the city is actually collecting comments and about the rules about rent stabilization that would go into effect May 1st. And so the comment period will be from April 7th through April 12th. And I put in the 2 links there that people can look at to see, share with individuals. And again, it's not this committee, but the city is collecting information there. And Troop D should have a link out to everybody for our own comments internally. So is there any other announcements or any questions about the link that I sent? Well, I think we're moving fast then. Maybe everyone's just really excited for our guest speaker today. Ed, do you wanna introduce Rebecca Walker?
Sure. Our speaker that we're going to have after we do a bit of polling of you is Rebecca Walker, and she works for the Mapping Prejudice Project. That's a project, project of historians looking at patterns of racial segregation and housing inequality in the Twin Cities. And in fact, it's a project that is national in its reputation because they're doing work with data and old deed restrictions that is really sort of precedent setting at this point. So we'll have Rebecca Walker with us later in the meeting. And I do notice that Councilmember Tolbert is with us right now. Not to put you on the spot, Councilmember Tolbert, but we were wondering if there are any updates on the City Council's actions related to the May 1st implementation.
Yeah, so the administration published draft rules on, I believe, Friday of last week. If I'm off on that, don't hold me to it, but I believe it was on Friday they published those. There will be a time, I believe it's April 7th to April 22nd, that people will be able to submit comments on the draft rules. And I should note the draft rules are for the ordinance as it currently stands, and it is assuming that the ordinance before the City Council tomorrow that can be voted on for final approval tomorrow would pass in its current form. So those draft rules are on the city's website. Most everything I think you can find on the rent stabilization, rent control page, and should be able to find those documents. But I believe, is that what we're implying for me to update people on?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, we didn't plan this out before, so.
We did. We did.
That I believe, the Department of Safety Inspections is the one who would be administering this. So I believe you would direct your comments towards them. As far as I know, the City Council will not be involved in any part of the draft rules outside of the definitions, which we will pass tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Tolbert. And just to reiterate, right, this is related to the ordinance that will be implemented beginning May 1st, separate from the work that we're doing. And as you know, that in the last few days, we've sent you information on the public input session that this task force is having on Tuesday, April 19th, Tuesday evening, April 12th. Sorry, did I say 19th? 12th, April 12th. So you got that flyer, which you can disseminate to your network as you wish. And there is a separate opportunity for people to either sign up for the public input that night or to provide written input. And there is a window of time for them to provide the written input. It will be open after today's meeting, and they will have until a few days after our public meeting, our public hearing meeting. So it'll be open until I think April 15th. So that window is separate from the one that Councilmember Tolbert talked about, and the topics are slightly different as well, right? So just want to keep those distinct in your minds.
And those links are in there from the public safety. So those are the two links I posted again, if anyone wants more information.
Okay, great, thank you. Arlene, you have your hand up?
Yes, I just have a few questions about the public meeting. I understood, or maybe I got this wrong. Does the 6 p.m. public hearing replace the meeting that we're going to have that same day? Or, will we be meeting at 1 o'clock Tuesday and then again for the public meeting at 6?
That's a great question, Arlene, and I don't know why we haven't thought of that to clear that up ahead of time. The public meeting that evening is in place of our regular meeting. It is, so we will not be meeting in the afternoon. Our meeting that day is to hear from the public on this.
And so what is our role in the meeting? Are we going to have a role, or are we just going to be there?
Just going to be observing.
Okay, and then is it a Zoom format for the meeting, or so will we be able to see everybody then? How is that, you know,
Right, and so I think everyone will be, I think those of you on the task force will be present and able to observe, but I think your videos will be off.
oh, okay.
And really, it's just the videos of the speakers as they are speaking that will be shown.
So will
Shruti?
we,
Shruti, do you have a?
Just
further-
wanted to elaborate on that. So what we're in right now is called a Zoom meeting, which is what allows us all the interaction. For the public meeting, to enable a wider audience, we moved to a webinar format. It'll be slightly different. I'm still trying to work out the kinks in terms of seeing if I can get people to get their video on, but that might be a limitation of the technology. So we may not be able to see speakers. So we're working through that with Zoom right now to figure out what's possible there.
and so will we, will we have any sense of how many are in the public meeting? I mean, if, you know, like, will there be numbers or something that we can say, oh, you know, I mean, if it's a webinar format, like, will there be 50 people or, you know, 100 people? Will we know that?
So while you're in the meeting, there'll be a list of attendees, so you can get a sense real time of who's attending, and people are required to put their names and emails, so you'll get that real time feedback. And then I will get on the back end a list of everyone who attended. So what the group would like to do with that list or that information, I think just let me know.
Okay, and then with the public testimony, is that something that we as a task force are going to take into consideration? Will that be something that, you know, so we hear people testifying, will that be something that then we act on it in some way, shape, or form?
Well, this is right. This is meant to provide you with more input and information in your deliberations. That's why we are having this. It's for you and for you to process. So.
Okay, great. And then just one last question. So what happens after the April 12th public hearing for this group? What will we be then in the following meeting talking about it, or?
Right, and I think that was related to Catherine's question. So yes, after the public hearing, then this group sort of pivots into a much more deliberative role to talk about policy options, to talk about what you heard in the public hearing. If you want us, the Cura team, to summarize or process the public hearing information, we'll do that, because you're going to get written comments as well. So we're going to have to summarize those for you. I don't know, you know, we'll follow the lead of the group. I don't know how much you want us to summarize it, because you probably want to read as much of the direct information as possible, so we can collect it all for you in one document and get it to you in a way that's easily read.
So we'll also get the written testimony as opposed to like people who are just actually testifying during the meeting. I mean, all the comments that people send in.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. That's all I have. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, all right, very good. All right, any other questions out there? All right. All right, well, very good. I think that the next thing that we're going to turn to is a set of poll questions that we have for you. So these are questions that we're going to be asking of you here in this meeting. And so they'll go to everyone, but I think obviously members of the Cura team and the St. Paul City staff who are in the meetings, please do not answer, or if you are given the question, please click the abstain button. This is a set of information we want to get from the members of the task force. And there are a series of questions about your preferences, your policy preferences at this point in time. So we're going to ask you a series of very specific questions about, what you think the cap should look like. We'll ask you a question about vacancy control and decontrol. And I want to make it clear that we're not asking you to commit to a position that you will have to then stick with and defend for the rest of our deliberations, because after all, we've only just begun the small group discussions. This is just an attempt to see where there are areas of agreement within the task force, and then where there is much more disagreement, because this will help us then focus the future conversations that we have. So we're really trying to get a temperature of the room really on these topics that you will have to be making decisions on. And so you're going to get a series of very specific questions. The other thing that I want to note about this is that you'll be given options for answers, right? This is the way the poll questions work in Zoom. You may not get all of the options that you think are out there, and you may not get questions on everything that you think we're going to need to talk about. And that's okay. This is just for us to get an idea of what the possibilities are and what the level of support is for different scenarios. This is not going to constrain you in your subsequent conversations at all, right? After this poll, you'll be able to talk about any topics you want, even ones that you don't see in this particular poll. So, and then finally, I guess all of the options that you will be given that we're going to be asking you about do come from real examples around the country of things that cities have done. And also, I think in virtually every one of them, they will be about a topic and an option that we've covered during our learning sessions. So this is not going to be, I don't think we're going to throw anything new at you. And I'll try to describe and explain things as we go along, because I know it's been several weeks since we talked about some of these topics. So the final thing I guess I would say is that not all members of the task force are here in attendance. And so those who are not in attendance will get this set of questions in an email so that we do really get the feelings of the full task force going forward. But for the next half hour, we're going to be giving you a series of questions which we would like you to answer right now. And then we will present to you the summary and the findings of those after we give the email polls to the rest of the group. All right, so that's what we're going to be about for the next 20-25 minutes or so. Any questions about that before we begin? All right. So Trupti, I'll let you know when I want you to pop the poll question up there, but I want to talk through them first, and then I'll signal you. All right. So question number one. The current St. Paul ordinance caps rents at a fixed 3%. In other places in the US, rents are capped at a variable rate. Typically, it's a rate that changes with the rate of inflation. So the first question we have for you is, if you had to state your preference right now at this point, before we've done any more deliberations, would you prefer a rent cap that is fixed, that is set at a specific percentage increase, or a rent cap that is variable? Trupti, you can provide the poll. So your two options are mixed, or fixed rather, and variable. And again, Cura staff and St. Paul City staff, please don't answer. We'll wait a couple more seconds for people to provide an answer to that. Okay, we have 27 answers to that. So all right, let's end that poll now. Tripti, thank you.
Do you want to see the results, Ed, or do you want?
No, we'll show the results after we've asked everyone on the task force.
Okay.
Unless, yeah, I mean, I think that's my feeling. Okay. All right, thank you. All right, number 2. For number 2, I want you to assume that the cap is at a fixed amount. Okay, so I know that some of you have already expressed a preference for a variable account, but I would still like all of you who did that to answer this question as well. Okay, so assume that the cap is a fixed amount. What percentage should it be? What percentage increase should it be? And your options are less than 3%, 3% as in the ordinance, between 3 and 5%, or right at 5%, or more than 5%. Tripti, can you? So again, we would like everyone to answer, even those of you who had a preference for variable. Right now, assume the cap is fixed. What do you think it should be at?
Should we be assuming there's a vacancy decontrol or not? Because that would matter a lot on these questions.
It would, Rich, and that's a weakness of this process, and it's conversations that we'll have. So at this point, I have to ask you to answer this without any assumption on a vacancy control or decontrol.
So it's a tough process because we know every question depends on another question, but to start off was, we're just trying to hone in on, like, if it lived in a vacuum, what would you think? And we will talk about every single item as well. And then it will allow us to figure out what's most important to people and sort of help you guys put packages together.
So and just for clarification, are we basically saying we're assuming the ordinance sits as it is, except for this change? For example, the ordinance just says no vacancy decontrol, right, at this point? Or am I misunderstanding what you're saying?
I think we're simply asking for your basic preference on this.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're not tying it to the current ordinance. It's just, if this lived in a vacuum, what are your thoughts on this piece of it?
Okay, thank you.
So we have 26 answers to this. That's one fewer than the previous question. Is there a 27th member out there? Going once.
Yes, I'm on, but I'm having some internet difficulties right now.
I'm sorry, Clara. Okay.
So they working on my apartment, so I'm trying to reconnect my internet into my house.
Okay. All right. So Clara, then we'll probably, for the questions that you miss, we'll be in touch with you after the meeting so that you can provide them to us then. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So then, Trupti, you can close the poll on this.
So that means I will miss the first two.
Okay. All right. That's fine. We'll be in touch with you and we can fill that in later. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. All right. Thank you, members. Question number 3. Now assume that the cap is a variable cap. All right. And that it's tied to inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. So the question here then is, assuming that the cap is variable, what should the cap be? And again, you have 4 categories of answers here. Trupti, you can post it. The first one is that the variable rate is less than the CPI. In other words, it's some percentage of the inflation rate, or it's equal to the CPI. It's exactly what the CPI is. Or it's more than the CPI, either up to 2 percentage points more or more than 2 percentage points above the CPI. So those are the 4 options, just to get an idea of where you are on these. Great. Okay, we're at 27. Thank you. All right, very good. Question number 4. Some cities, as you may recall, combine a fixed and a variable rate. As an example, there are some cities that set the cap at the rate of inflation, the CPI, but they also establish a higher and or a lower limit, right? A limit above which the rent increases cannot go, or a limit below which the allowable rates cannot go. And so the question here is simply a yes/no one. Would you, is it acceptable to you to think about and to have a combination of a fixed and variable rate, a cap that is set at the rate of inflation, but also has either a high and or a lower limit? And so Trupti, and this is just a yes/no, is this something that you would consider acceptable or not? Or consider preferable? Okay, we have 27 responses to that. Thank you very much. On to number 5. Number 5. Should the program have vacancy control, that is, the rent cap applies when there is a vacancy, as in the current ordinance, or some form of vacancy decontrol, that is, the property owner can raise rents above the cap when there is a vacancy? So Trupti, the question here is just 2 options. Should the program have vacancy control or vacancy decontrol in some form? All right, we have 29 responses to this. A couple of members have joined us. We're through. All right, I think we're good here to go. Thank you. On to question number 6. Now, assuming that there is vacancy decontrol, all right, which of the following do you favor? Complete vacancy decontrol, that is, the owner may raise rents as much as they wish when there is a vacancy, or as much, or partial vacancy decontrol, that the owner may raise rents above the regular cap, but only up to some set maximum. All right, so here I would like, again, everyone to answer, even those of you who preferred vacancy control. I would like you all to answer this question: complete or partial? Wait another second or so. We have 28 responses to this. Is there anyone else out there? Okay, let's close that and move on to question number 7. In some cities, vacancy decontrol is allowed, but only under certain conditions, such as an acceptable level of maintenance, or a statement from the previous tenant that they were not pressured to move out. So assuming that the program has some form of vacancy decontrol, is it your preference that decontrol should be conditioned on any factor? Or should it be automatic? So that is question number 7. Assuming that there is vacancy decontrol, should it be automatic or should it be conditioned on some other factor, such as acceptable level of maintenance or a statement of lack of pressure to move. Okay, we're at 28 responses here. All right, thank you very much. On to the next question. The next set of questions relate to other exceptions to the cap. Some ordinances make provisions for specific cost pass-throughs, such as capital improvements and property taxes. Other ordinances have a provision for a reasonable rate of return that encompasses an entire range of possible pass-throughs. So question number 8 is, the current ordinance calls for a process of allowing for a reasonable rate of return. Do you favor this method of allowing for potential pass-throughs of extraordinary costs? And this is just a yes, no. We're at 25 responses. There's a couple more. There are a couple more of you out there, perhaps. Give another minute or less than a minute. Going once, going twice. All right, thank you very much. Let's close that. All right. Assume, question number 9, assume there are pass-throughs. Assume also that the pass-through is amortized, right? Remember, it's spread out over many months so that only small portions of it are realized by tenants every month. The next question is, which of the following do you prefer? That the owner can pass through 100% of the cost, or only a portion of the cost? We've seen, remember, that cities do it in both ways. So question 9A here is, owner can pass through 100% of the cost or only a portion. So what's your preference on that? There are other questions on this. I'd like you to focus on the first one. Which is simply the question of whether owners are able to pass through all of the costs. I only see one answer here so far.
So we submit it if we've
I think
only,
you have to submit them all, Ed.
Okay,
You
all
can't
right.
submit one at a time.
All right, let's do that. Let's go through them all. The second option on this question is, should there be an upper cap to the total rent increase, even when there is a pass-through? That is, a limit that is above the regular cap, which would allow the pass-through, but still be having a top limit. Or option B, should there be no upper cap when a pass-through is approved? So that's the second option there. Number 3 then is some cities allow pass-throughs that vary by the size of the building, which is usually determined by the number of units. So, or should the allowable pass-throughs be the same for buildings of all sizes? And then finally, D, some cities condition their pass-throughs on other factors, such as maintenance and health and safety code compliance, and other cities allow pass-throughs that are not conditioned on these factors. So we're asking you to weigh in on all of these different dimensions of pass-throughs here.
Can you talk about 3C just a little bit more?
Certainly. Some cities will allow small building owners to pass through 100% of their costs, whereas large building developers are limited in the percentage of the cost that they're allowed to pass through. So that's what that's getting at.
Thank you.
We're at 25 responses. We'll wait for one or two more. We're at 27. Great. All right, we'll close that one. Sorry, that's the only one that had multiple dimensions to it. Sorry about that. Question number 10. Should property owners be allowed to bank preferential rents? So if you remember what banking is, if an owner raises the rents at a rate that is below the cap, the question is, can they at some later point raise rents up to where the cap would have been had they been raising the rents at the maximum rate? So can they recoup and bank and recoup that preferential rate at a later date? So this is simply a yes, no. Should banking be allowed or not? We're at 26 responses. Bill says he's not seeing the poll. You're not seeing your question?
I don't know why I saw everyone up till now.
Ed, I'm not seeing my question either. This is Clara.
Okay. So you're not actually seeing the question so that you can answer it. Is that it?
No, I'm just seeing you.
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't know what happened with my computer, but maybe you can send it to me later.
Okay. For all of you.
The same for me. This is Monica.
Okay. All right. I don't know why that's happening. It sounds like it's happening to a lot of people, however. All right, let's end this question and we'll continue we'll follow up with everyone about the questions they were able to answer or not. And make sure everyone gets a shot at answering them all. All right. Next question. If there is banking, should there be a limit in any form to the amount banked? So some cities, for example, only allow a property owner to bank for X number of years, or there is an upper limit to the amount that you can recoup in a given year. We're not, and so we're asking a simple yes, no question. Should there be a limit in any kind of form to the amount banked? All right, Tony Santa is suggesting for those who can't see it, try hitting the poll button at the bottom of your screen if you're not seeing it. But we've got 27 responses to this. So it looks like you all have seen this one. All right, let's close that one. and move to the next question. And this begins a couple of questions. We're almost done, folks. Please hang in here. The next set of questions are about housing stock exemptions. And question number 12 is a yes/no question. Should
Ed, can I interrupt?
Yes.
So the results for number 11 just came back on in that, so.
Okay, they were just shown?
Yeah, they're showing right now question number 11. So question number 12 is not showing it. It shows question number 11. So maybe it's one behind.
Okay, all right. All right, Trupti, can we close question number 11? Oh, Tony, I see.
Yep.
You may be, go ahead.
Okay, I saw
That's
that.
true. Tony, yeah, you are seeing them as host. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, all right. So question number 12 then, you can post now. Yes, no. Should the program exempt rental units in buildings with 4 or fewer units? We have 26 responses. Anyone else? All right, we're at 27. All right, thank you. We can close 12. Number 13, should the program exempt rental units in smaller buildings with 4 or fewer units only if the owner lives in the building? All right, so this is different from the previous question. And it's asking about the same type of buildings, 4 or fewer units, but suggesting that the exemption should only be if the owner is living in the building. Okay, we have 27. Thank you. Question number 14. Should the program exempt rental units in single-family homes? Yes, no. All right, very good. Thank you. Let's close that. Question number 15. Let's assume that the program has a new construction exemption. Which approach do you favor? A construction exemption that is based on a specific date, that is, all buildings built after the year 20 ... are exempt, or a exemption that is a rolling exemption based on the number of years since construction. For example, all buildings younger than X number of years. So a construction exemption based on a specific date, or a rolling exemption based on the number of years. Anyone else out there? All right, let's close that one. Question number 16, only 3 more to go. Assuming the program does have a rolling exemption, which of the following do you favor? Less than 10-year exemption, a 10-year exemption, a 15-year exemption, 20-year exemption, or more than 20-year exemption. So now again, we're assuming that it's a rolling, and so we would like everyone's answer. We have 25 responses, a couple more. Okay, 25 responses. We'll close it there. Question number 17. Do you support an exemption for assisted housing units where rents are based on a percentage of tenants' income, similar to what is in the current ordinance? Should there be an exemption for subsidized and assisted housing where the rents are pegged to the tenant's income? All right, we're up at 27 already. That was good. Number 18. Do you feel that some form of a rent board should be created to administer the ordinance and preside over disputes and petitions? For example, reasonable rate of return requests, et cetera. So this is a yes/no question about whether you feel some form of a rent board should be created. All right, that's 27 responses. Thank you. Last question that we have for you. Now let's assume that the program does create a rent board. I would like all of you to weigh in on how the board should be filled. Should it be an elected board or should it be appointed? All right, we can end this poll. Thank you. Those are all the questions that we have for you. So again, let me remind everyone once again what's going to be done with this. We're going to make sure that everyone who isn't here tonight gets these questions. Remembering that this is simply to get a temperature of the room, where people are at this stage. And we will this will help us sort of frame the conversations that we have moving forward by highlighting those places where there is more significant disagreement. And we'll get this back to you as soon as possible on this. So any additional questions about this at this point?
Hey, Ed, I have a question.
Yes.
Question 17, I believe it was 17. Is there currently an exemption for Section 8 vouchers?
There is an exemption. There is an exemption for renters whose rent is based on a percentage of their income. So there is that. I don't have the ordinance in front of me. Trom has put something in the chat that describes the
Okay, because section 18, they pay 30% of their, they pay 30% of their income. So that's the reason why. Are we saying that section 8 tenants are exempt from rent control? Those section 8 landlords are exempt from rent control?
Well, that a question like number 17 would be that kind of question. That's correct, which is that if you're operating subsidized housing that is tied to a tenant's income, should that housing be exempt from the rent control ordinance?
So Ed, can I just ask, just to put a finer point on it, meaning, like we enter into a housing assistance payment contract with HUD, and HUD sets the rents. Regardless of what those are, the tenants will never pay more than 30% of their income. So if it's not exempt, would that mean that this ordinance would take precedence over HUD's willingness to increase fair market rents? Right.
Maisha is correct about this. Those would be exempt because it's federal. Anything with a federal subsidy is not covered anyway by a municipal rent control.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so to clarify, Ed, section 8 landlords are exempt from rent control then, right?
Only if the tenant's income increases enough for their income-based rent to increase more than 3%. If the tenant's income doesn't increase more than a certain amount, let's say the tenant's income doesn't change at all, then currently drafted, their rent you wouldn't be able to increase their rent more than 3% because their rent is income-based.
I don't think that's accurate.
Yeah,
if I can,
I have a question about
right.
If I can really quick, it's federal programming. So if it's federal programming, it doesn't apply at all, period. Federal programming is exempt. So whether that's HUD, whether it's section 8, whether it's scatter housing, whether it's PHA, public housing agency, period. If it is a federal program, it's exempt, period.
Okay, so
and I would agree to that, and I understood it to be that the only place where it sounds like the landlord is exempt is from all the other parameters of this program. But as far as a rent increase and the cap, anybody participating in a Section 8 program is not included in that. It's only the other parameters of the program that landlord is going to be tied to, was my understanding. Are you saying that that's not true?
What I'm saying, sorry, Ed.
Well, what I'm saying is that we're now having a conversation about the current ordinance, and the question for you that I asked in number 17 was a hypothetical question about how you want to address things moving forward. Do you want to exempt housing that is based on a tenant's income, where the rent is based on tenant's income? So that's separate. I cannot answer legally. I don't have that authority to interpret the existing ordinance for you. So
clarification to your question: are you saying that they're exempt specifically from the cap on the rent increase, or are you saying anybody that participates in Section 8 housing is exempt from the entire rent control program?
The question was, do you support an exemption for assisted housing units where rents are based on a tenant's income? So the unit would be exempt under this question. That was what question 17 was.
For the entire program though, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's what question 17 was about. So.
Thank you for clarifying, Ed.
Okay, all right. So look, at this point, we're a few minutes before the hour. We will have a speaker for the second hour of our meeting. So Tony, I suggest we take a break at this point.
Yeah, let's take we have 5-minute break or 7-minute break based on time?
Yeah, whatever you want.
All right, let's take a 7-minute break, come back at 2 o'clock, and then we'll hear our speaker.
Hey guys, are we gonna have a breakout group or no?
Depending on how long the speaker goes, and how close it is to the end of the hour, we're going to evaluate at that point to have breakout rooms to discuss the speaker, or if it's too close to it, we may end a little bit early if it's like 2:50, if it's not enough time to have a reasonable conversation. So we're going to see how long the speaker is, and then we're going to reevaluate based on that in some sessions to be able to go over stuff.
All right, thank you.
And Trupti and Rebecca, we're all ready to go when we come back?
I think so. Rebecca, you should have screen share ability. Can you just check if you've got that option underneath your screen sharing?
It looks like, oh, it looks like I do. I can't go on and share yet because the audio screen, but I do have the option.
Okay, great, perfect. So
All right.
I'll give you that control in just a couple minutes here when I stop my screen. So
Perfect.
All right.
Becca, do you want to check if your screen can be shared? Perfect.
You seeing that?
Yep, I'm starting to see it. In a
Cool.
second.
Great.
Yes. Excellent.
Should I just keep it up? Is that fine?
I think that's fine. So we'll let people know that it's ready to go, and then Tony will give us a signal to start.
Sounds good.
Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you got a short break and we're excited. We felt it important, to look at, some of the issues of why rent stabilization may have come up with, and some of the hardships that have been in the community for years. It's just another talking point, and some of the conversations have gotten emotional when there's reasons for that, inequalities that are in our community. So without further ado, I guess I'm introducing Mrs. Walker. And you're on mute.
There it is. Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. Thank you. And thank you very much for having me here today. Yeah, okay.
I still can't hear her. What's auto?
Are folks having trouble hearing me?
We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay. Okay, great. My name is Rebecca Walker. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota. I study urban planning. And I've also been a researcher or researched in collaboration with the Mapping Prejudice Project for the last 3 years. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of housing discrimination in St. Paul. I'll request that I'll plan to answer all questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to drop questions or comments or other insights into the chat. I think that would be great. I'll say that I'm not originally from the Twin Cities, so I often, almost every time I talk about the history of the Twin Cities with people who are from here, I learn something new. And so, yeah, I welcome additional insights from people who live in St. Paul and call it home. And I guess with that, I'll get started. Okay, so to start, I'm going to take us back in time to St. Paul at the turn of the century, so the early 1900s. This is a view of St. Paul from around 1900. I think it's taken from Frogtown looking towards the river. The Capitol should be just over to the left of this image. And to start us off, the protagonist of our story is William T. Francis. So William T. Francis was a Black man who was born in Missouri, and he moved to St. Paul at the age of 18 in 1887. He quickly rose through the ranks at Northern Pacific Railway, so the company that James J. Hill founded, and became a clerk. And then in 1901, he attended law school, got his law degree, and returned to Northern Pacific Railway as the chief legal officer for the company, which made him at this point in time the highest ranking Black official at any business in Minnesota. William Francis was active in St. Paul's Black political and social life. He attended the Pilgrim Baptist Church, which is the first Black church to be established in the state of Minnesota. It was established in 1886. And really since then has been a center of Black, not only religious and spiritual life, but also political and social life. So the NAACP and the Urban League would hold their meetings at this church. Many social clubs would also hold gatherings at the church. And so this was really key to William Francis's social life as well. So to give you a little context for what St. Paul looks like when William Francis arrives, this is a map from 1884. And at this time, St. Paul is much smaller than it is today. There's no motorized transit, so it's much more walkable. You have to be able to walk from everywhere you need to go, basically. And because of that, the city landscape is much more mixed. So your home is maybe right next to or on the same block with light industrial areas. And then maybe on the same corner, you might have the shop where you're buying your groceries. So we don't see the same land use segregation that we see in the city today. So just to give you a sense of the scale, the green line shows the boundaries of St. Paul in 1884, while the red line shows the boundaries of St. Paul today. Okay, so let's jump forward to 1908. So this is just after William Francis has gotten his law degree. At this time, St. Paul is growing. The population is growing as immigrants arrive from Europe, many from Scandinavian countries and also other parts of Europe. And the population is also growing as many Black Americans leave the South sort of in the aftermath of Reconstruction and move north looking for more political and economic opportunity in northern cities. So we're seeing a growing Black population in St. Paul during this time as well. As the city's population is growing, its footprint is growing. And this was made possible through streetcars, which opened up new residential areas. So again, this is St. Paul. The green line is St. Paul in 1886. And by 1908, we're seeing especially expansion to the west towards Minneapolis, new residential areas emerging. And again, this was really facilitated by the streetcar lines, which allowed people to move sort of beyond walking distance from their place of work and enabled the establishment of new neighborhoods that were exclusively for residential use. So here's the streetcar line, and you can see the cathedral in St. Paul. I believe this is the Selby Avenue streetcar line. Okay, so back to William T. Francis. It's 1924. He's been in private law practice since 1912. He argued many of Minnesota's first civil rights cases, including a case in which Black women were being arrested by St. Paul police officers and not being charged with any crimes and held. So he argued that case in state court. Beyond his legal work, he was a political activist. He led the local ban on the film The Birth of a Nation, which was extremely racist. And his wife, Nellie, was also a really impressive political activist at this time. So Nellie Francis led the charge to pass Minnesota's anti-lynching law in 1920 after a really horrific lynching in Duluth. And just to note, it was only this year that the federal government passed its own anti-lynching law. And so Nellie was able to get this law passed at the Minnesota state level a whole century before the federal government could. And so this family they're thriving. They're like at the upper echelon of Black society in St. Paul. And they're looking to buy their dream home in 1924. And they set their sights on a property located at 2092 Sargent Avenue in the Met Groveland neighborhood. And so somewhat like today, this neighborhood at this time in the 20s was really one of the poshest and most expensive neighborhoods in St. Paul. And as people who've been very successful in their careers, they were looking to take advantage of all of the amenities that this neighborhood had to offer. However, their time in their dream home there was really quickly met with white violence and intimidation. First, the local neighborhood association tried to buy the house from them, say, we'll buy the house from you, you all leave and never come back and we'll never speak of this again. Being the civil rights activists that they were like, hell no. So they continued living there. White mobs marched on the house with burning torches. They sent threatening letters. They sent threatening phone calls. All of these attempts to really threaten the couple with violence and force them to leave. And this culminated with at least 2 instances of the KKK burning crosses in the front yard of the home. The police were no help to the couple, and they ultimately hired a private security force to protect them and persevered and continued living there for 3 years until they ultimately left the city of St. Paul as William relocated for work. And I wanted to start with this example because I think that it really like puts you in the moment of sort of the tension at the time and sort of in response to not just this incident, but the numerous incidences of white mob violence as people of color tried to move into these neighborhoods, both in St. Paul and in Minneapolis, led to the introduction of all of these policy efforts and legal tools to try and enforce segregation. So at the start of the 20th century, we really start to see the emergence of racial segregation in American cities, as well as sort of the spread of white efforts to police the color line. And so in this graph here, both of these, the gray and the black line, just to represent different indices of segregation. And then our x-axis is the years. And so as the lines go up, our cities are getting more segregated. And you can see the rise in segregation in American cities really takes off beginning in 1910 and continuing through the 1930s and 40s until it reaches its peak at about the mid-century point. And so there's this question of how did St. Paul go through the city that we saw in 1886, where it's really very mixed. There aren't strong patterns of racial segregation, to a quite segregated city. So during this time period, at the first half of the 20th century, we already mentioned there's a growing Black middle class. In the 1920s, the Rondo neighborhood emerged as the center of Black life in St. Paul. But that said, St. Paul was quite diverse. Many neighborhoods had populations of people of color. But by 1940, more than 90% of St. Paul's Black population had been concentrated into the Rondo neighborhood. So this map is from 1935. And you can see that at this point, they're highlighting the concentration of Black people in the Rondo neighborhood. And so Mapping Prejudice has been working to try and understand some of the history that enabled the production of this segregation, particularly looking at how real estate developers, landlords, property owners, and city politicians work to inscribe racism into the built environment. Mapping Prejudice has specifically been looking at the history of racially restrictive housing covenants. So racial covenants are clauses that are inserted into the deeds into a property deed when you purchase a home. And these were used to restrict the sale or occupancy of a property to just white people. So to prevent it from being sold to a person of color. So these covenants might look something like this. This is from a deed in Hennepin County. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not of the full blood of the so-called Caucasian or white race. And so you can see this like very, very racist language sort of embedded in these eugenics ideas of the time. And these became very powerful legal tools. So a racial covenant ran with the property. It was attached to the deed of the property itself. So if a homeowner put a racial covenant on a property when they first bought it, that racial covenant sticks with that piece of property no matter how many times that property is sold. And if at any point that property is sold to a person of color in violation of the racial covenant, it would then revert back to the original owner who put the racial covenant on the property. Or their heirs. And so they became not only very racist, but extremely powerful and long-lasting legal tools used to produce and enforce segregation in cities across the US. And so racial covenants were used by real estate developers, like primarily in the Twin Cities, they were enacted by real estate developers rather than individual homeowners. And they were used as a way of selling the perceived value of whiteness to their prospective clients. And so these real estate developers weren't shy about this. You can see here, this is an advertisement from a development in Minneapolis near Lake of the Isles. And the developer is including the language of the racial restriction and the advertisement itself. So he's really selling this as like a selling point for these properties. This wasn't limited to Minneapolis. It also happened in St. Paul. So here you can see the developer is encouraging prospective buyers, don't forget the restrictions, read them again, and then you read through. And the fourth one includes the restriction that the property cannot be sold or leased to any colored people. And so this was being sold to prospective buyers as a good thing, as something you should want in your property. So clearly they're targeting white buyers and playing into this white fear through these racial restrictions. And the consequences of this was that the new development that was happening sort of in the Matt Groveland neighborhoods, the neighborhoods to the west and north and east of downtown St. Paul, as well as the suburbs and the outer lying suburbs of St. Paul. This new development and all of the capital that was flooding into these new developments was really reserved for the exclusive use of white people. And this prevented people of color from purchasing homes in these neighborhoods. And as a consequence, it determined who was able to accumulate intergenerational wealth through home ownership and who wasn't. So as many of you probably know, Mapping Prejudice started its work in Hennepin County, so focusing on Minneapolis first. So this is the map, the complete map of racial covenants that they've produced for Hennepin County. And you can see, sort of as we've been talking about already, the covenants are most common in the neighborhoods that are sort of on the outskirts of the city, further away from downtown, and then they're quite pervasive in the suburb neighborhoods. So this gives you sort of a more complete picture of the pattern of racial covenants in a city. I'm going to share very, very preliminary data from Ramsey County. So this represents the map when probably less than a quarter of the deeds from Ramsey County had been analyzed and mapped. This is not the complete picture of racial covenants in Ramsey County. I was told to make sure I make that caveat many, many times. So I don't want you all to walk away thinking like, oh, Ramsey County had basically none compared to Hennepin. We don't think that's the case. This is just quite preliminary data to start to get a sense for what the spatial pattern might look like in St. Paul. And as you can see, again, it's the neighborhoods that are to the west, Como Park neighborhood to the north, and some of the neighborhoods of East St. Paul, where we're really starting to see that higher concentration of racial covenants, as well as developments in the suburbs of Ramsey County. So I mentioned that real estate developers were the primary people adding these covenants to properties. But they really worked in concert with neighborhood improvement associations to enforce the racial covenants. So these are some anti-integration protesters in St. Paul. And the neighborhood improvement associations would be the ones to bring suits against violators of the racial covenant. So if a person of color was able to successfully purchase a home with a covenant on it, neighborhood associations would then file I think civil filings against them and get the sale revoked and the home taken from them. So the Supreme Court ruled racial covenants unenforceable in 1948, but neighborhood associations continued to play a key role in really policing the color line in these white neighborhoods. This was through intimidation, this was through violence, this was also through the collaborative agreements among neighbors to agree not to sell or rent to any people of color. And then beyond racial covenants, real estate developers used other tools to try and produce and protect segregation. So we talked about racial covenants. They also included other exclusionary language in deeds that wasn't necessarily explicitly racial. So they might say something like, no undesirable persons are allowed to purchase this home, but obviously the definition of undesirable is pretty subjective and at this time was pretty racist. Or they would include other things like class restrictions, like you have to be able to build a home that's worth $5,000, which at this point was a lot of money, if you want to purchase this land. And so these were other tools that they would use to ensure the racial makeup of a neighborhood. Also, sort of an infamous real estate practice is racial steering, racial biases, and home appraisals. And this like racist ideology became very explicit in the code of ethics of the National Association of Real Estate Boards. So if you are going to be a licensed realtor, you have to promise not to make any real estate transactions that might lead to the integration of a neighborhood. And so again, this is another advertisement for a neighborhood in Minneapolis, and you can see they're really selling the fact that the lots have restrictions on them. Oh, cool. Okay, it loaded. Great. So I've talked a lot about private actors in this, but city governments also played a key role in enacting policies to promote segregation. So in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion about the role of zoning ordinances in promoting segregation. So at the turn of the 20th century, many cities across America tried to enact racial zoning laws, but those were pretty quickly ruled unenforceable or illegal by the US Supreme Court. And so city zoning ordinances after 1917 onward weren't explicitly racist, like explicitly racial, but they were racist. So they would designate certain areas as single family only. And so if you wanted to purchase a home and anywhere in St. Paul that is colored yellow, so this is the contemporary zoning map, you had to be able to afford a single family home. So if you were lower or middle class and you could really only purchase a home if it was a duplex or maybe a fourplex, you wouldn't be able to purchase in these neighborhoods. And instead, these neighborhoods were just for people who could afford to buy a single family home. And the consequences of this had deeply racialized effects. Then in the 1930s, the federal government got involved. So this is in the aftermath of the Great Depression. And the federal government wanted to reduce the riskiness of mortgage lending for homes. And so they hired agents in cities across America to produce these maps for the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a federal agency at this time. And so these agents would rate neighborhoods of the cities from A, which was the best, shown in green on this map, B, which was considered still desirable, C, which were neighborhoods that were definitely declining, and D, which were neighborhoods that were hazardous in terms of their riskiness for mortgage lending. And you can see that the D neighborhoods are colored in red on the map, and that's where the term redlining comes from. And these designations were based explicitly on the racial demographics of the neighborhood. And so if a neighborhood had a population of Black people, it was almost always redlined. They weren't just racist against Black people. It's important to say, if your neighborhood had any substantial population of Asian Americans, it also was almost always redlined. This policy was really very racist against Asian Americans as well. And the redlining assessors also took presence of racial covenant into account when they were making their redlining designation. So if you were going to get this like best A rating, a neighborhood almost always had to have racial covenants and racial restrictions on it. And that was seen as a really good thing by the federal assessors. And so the patterns that were established by racial covenants and racial exclusion in which people of color weren't able to access particular neighborhoods, then directly shaped how these redlining maps were drawn. So given this, if you are a Black resident of St. Paul in the first half of the 20th century, the odds are really stacked against you in terms of accessing homeownership. For much of the city, you are unable to purchase a home because there are these racial restrictions on the properties, particularly in the most desirable neighborhoods. So those neighborhoods are out. Then, after the redlining policy is enacted, if you want to purchase a home that doesn't have racial restrictions, you are basically ineligible for a traditional mortgage. You can't get a federally backed mortgage, and the only mortgages that are available to you are predatory lending, making homeownership extremely difficult for Black people in St. Paul to access at this time, and really contributing to what we see today as one of the largest disparities in homeownership rates in the country is we have in the Twin Cities. However, if you were able to persevere through all of these challenges that the legal system is throwing at you, and you're able to purchase a home as a Black person in St. Paul, it was probably in the Rondo neighborhood. This was really the center of Black political life during the first half of the 20th century. And then the local and federal government throws at you highway construction. So in 1956, the city, in collaboration with the federal government, decide to run I-94 directly through the heart of the Rondo neighborhood, and destroying hundreds and hundreds of homes and businesses, as well as political, cultural, social institutions. Now, this decision was met with fierce community protests. There was tons of community organizing and opposition to this plan to run I-94 through Rondo, but the city went forth with this plan. So 75% of the people displaced by I-94's construction through St. Paul were Black, and this comes to about 600 families. And just a few more images of Rondo, or the construction of I-94. And again, we're seeing this is Pilgrim Baptist Church. So this is really the heart of Black life in St. Paul at the time. These many layers of policies have sort of compounded upon one another, and today continue to shape the racial demographics of St. Paul. So this is data from, I think, the 2015-2019 American Community Survey. And it shows the percentage of people in a neighborhood who identify as white. So lighter colors, the lightest color on the map indicates neighborhoods where the population is more than 80% white. And you can see that still really tracks with the neighborhoods that had racial covenants. So we're looking at the Matt Groveland neighborhood, the Highland Park neighborhood, the Como Park neighborhood. Those areas had racial restrictions historically, and today continue to be quite white. I want to also be sure, so I'm supposed to be talking about the historical context, but many of the policies that I have mentioned, policies or practices that I've mentioned, are still happening today in some form, maybe with like slightly less racially explicit language or a slightly different name, but with still very racialized implications for access to home ownership. So there continues to be bias in real estate appraisals, with homes that are owned by people of color being valued less than comparable homes owned by white people. Discriminatory lending is still quite common. Predatory lending is still quite common, leading to a disproportionate rate of foreclosures among people of color. This is data from the Great Recession in 2008. And you can see, so the lines go white, Asian, Black, Hispanic. And so you can see that the foreclosure crisis of the Great Recession disproportionately impacted Black homeowners and Hispanic or Latinx homeowners. And that's because these communities were specifically targeted for predatory lending. And so I've been talking about history, but these things are happening today as well. And this continues to shape where people are able to own homes and where people aren't. So in this map, the darker purple colors indicate a higher percentage of households in the neighborhood own their own home. And you can see the areas that are predominantly white tend to have a much higher rate of home ownership. The areas that are home to the majority of the city's people of color have a much lower rate of home ownership. So we can really see that racial gap in home ownership playing out in these maps. I think that's all I have at this point. I'll take questions. I'm going to stop sharing, but if folks want to look at a particular map or something again, I'm happy to show that. And sorry, I haven't been following what's in the chat, but if there are questions for me in there, feel free to voice them now.
Rebecca, there are some comments, but there were no specific questions. So I really invite people to open up and share any questions or maybe just observations.
I got a pretty specific question. How do you think this relates to rent control?
And in my opinion, I think what's pretty clear from this data is the people who are most impacted by rent control are people of color in St. Paul. And that this isn't an accident, but this is the consequence of a century of explicitly racist policies that made access to home ownership really, really difficult for people of color in St. Paul, and comparably much easier for white people in St. Paul.
I have a question.
Wait, we have a couple questions, so I'm going to call them out just to make it a little easier. Clara?
I don't have a question. Oh,
I'm going to come back to you. Nene? Nene, is your hand up?
I don't know why my audio is not working.
All right, Clara, back to you.
Oh, I should have stayed in there.
Clara, we can hear you.
Oh, I'm gonna have to leave there.
Okay, I don't see any more hands up, but if there's somebody that has a question or a comment.
Sorry, I had to turn on my headset. So my question is this. We talk about rental, not rental control, but as far as the restricted covenants and its impact on home ownership. But I guess I want to also have a conversation when we talk about rent control. My question that I want to put there is, how do you ensure this doesn't have an unintended consequence that makes it so that people are more interested in being a renter than being a homeowner? Because that's what builds wealth. That's throughout your whole program here. I believe that if you do put on a rent cap, that there is an unintended consequence of people are becoming more complacent with the rental approach. Can you talk about how this racial restrictive covenant could have a correlation effect as far as the reverse effect, and how you may see that may have some correlation? And if not, that's fine. if we're going to talk about home ownership, I think that we need to make sure we have a conversation on the fact that we should be inspiring people to be able to build their wealth. And my understanding nationally, the number one way to do it is through home ownership.
And I want to just add one thing, and Mr. Walker, I'll let you answer, but let's make sure that that what we're asking her on opinions on what she would brought in here, and not on things that she may or not be an expert on. So I don't want to answer for her, but I'll let her answer the question, and then I got Malik, and then Chu, and then Arlene in that order. So Rebecca, go ahead.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate that, and I'll say, I'll caveat like my opinions, but that's not necessarily my area of expertise. I do think we can look at the data from racial covenants. There have been economists who have looked at sort of the value of the homes that were racially covenanted, and we can see that that those homes are worth more today, which reflects, the value that these had and the ability of people who were able to own those homes to generate intergenerational wealth. That said, I don't, my 2 cents on that question are, I think that having affordable rent is key for people to be able to save money to purchase a home. As a renter who is struggling to pay rent, I'm also having a really hard time saving money to buy a home. And also, many people rent for reasons. If they want to be mobile for work, if they haven't found the neighborhood that fits them. And so I think making rent equitable and accessible for everybody is a really valuable goal for civic life in St. Paul.
Thank you. And I don't want this conversation to get too contentious. And we can maybe have a couple breakout rooms as I see some of the questions, about gentrification, stabilization, whose right it is to do what. So I want to make sure we go through this process, educating ourselves. I will be putting up the schedule for the rest of the time at the end of the meeting, where we will have some conversations, and hopefully, it gives us opportunities to negotiate, learn more, and have two-way conversations. So Chu, you're next up.
Yeah, thanks. It's kind of interesting when we're talking about redlining. When I first heard about rent control and all these policies that was going to make it harder for people of color like myself who actually lived on Section 8 and public housing to be able to buy homes and invest in home and build wealth. I see this as a way to redline people of color, people that want this opportunity by making it harder in St. Paul. House hacking is one of the best ways of how a person who's making minimum wage can buy a duplex to live in one unit and rent out the other and start building wealth that way. So this, we have to, just learning this, we have to come up with a policy that's not going to cut or redline people like myself to build wealth using real estate, because that's what they're doing. They're giving the big corporate landlords exemptions from rent control, but yet the small mom and pop landlord, the individual who only owns a couple properties, they're basically, not providing any exemptions, and that's going to cut off a lot of these wealth building opportunities. So that's just a statement I want to make.
And I'll just add a caveat: in no way is this against the larger landlords or investors. The hope is that we always go back to the list that we made, what equality law looks like, and that means for small businesses to prosper, for large businesses to make a reasonable rate of return, and all the other things that you put on a group on the list before when you put on both hats. So that really should be the value of this committee as you go looking for it, and it's going to affect everyone in a different way. So Malik and then Arlene.
Just want to say thank you, Ms. Walker, for your information, but wanted to kind of get you to chime in on the information that you presented was essentially federally funded and restricted access to people of color for home ownership. Now we're at the place we're at now. It seems like the onus is being placed on the current specific homeowners or investors, as you want to call it, that provide housing would you say that the responsibility should be more on the current specific owners and investors to right the wrong, or would you say that the ownership should be on the government and the municipalities, essentially who enacted these policies, to right the wrong?
I'll say I strongly support reparations for the history of racial covenants. And however that plays into this conversation, I think is more for y'all to decide.
Right, and I think what she's saying is that's, she outlined, she supports reparations and racism has caused a lot of harm in this country for a long time, and we do need to find ways to repair it. And if I'm being devil's advocate, the question is rent control the only way, one of the ways, or a contributor to making sure people can live in a safe environment with an affordable situation based on, the past kind of put them in the situation there. Arlene?
Thank you. Rebecca, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your presentation. I do have a question, but I'm sure a lot of us were aware of some of the things like redlining, but you made it so crystal clear about what's been going on, for more than a century. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you was, since you're doing this kind of look back and, the impact of all those things, do you have any opinion about the Great Recession that happened in 2008, 2009, and the impact that it's had with corporate investors buying up properties recently? Is that part of what you're looking at in terms of what's happening with housing and that kind of thing?
I think definitely that's something that I've been paying a lot of attention to in terms of what's happening with housing. I don't have a lot more to add. I think that corporate consolidation in the housing market doesn't benefit the renter or the tenant. I think that that's pretty clear. That kind of capitalization of housing, it makes it harder for people to access those properties. Beyond that, I'm not sure that I have a ton to add, but thank you for the question.
And again, we wanted to make sure that, there are a lot of different people on the spectrum here as far as where you lie on rent control, where you lie on equity. We really wanted to lend a voice because it was a comment that some of the people made. So especially as things got emotional, people understood why. And I think when you know the historical relevance of it, you understand why people feel threatened and want basic human rights. And I'm not saying that there is a right answer. Rent control is one of the options on the table. It's been voted on. And I think what the city would like is to make sure that laws going forward are good for everybody. At the same time, I think everyone agrees that historically, this country hasn't been kind to people of color. And we want to make sure that we find ways to support everyone to live in a safe community. Clara?
Sorry about the internet difficulties. I really like your presentation too. I was taking pictures of it, but it just reminds me of how far back history go. And here we are still through Rondo in the 21st century, still having the same conversation, right? Gentrification and displacement in urban communities, right? And so what that makes me feel like is that one reason why I'm here in the Mayor Task Force anyway is because when you start raising rents to the fact that renters cannot afford to pay the rent, and then they're not even able to save money to buy a house because they're not making a living wage, right? And then what is the government responsibility in all this when they know that people cannot afford to pay the rent? And like when you were showing the maps where the wealth is that would be Oakdale, Woodbury, Maplewood in this present time, Blacks can't even access rental units or housing out there. So that's a big conversation. People wondering why Blacks or Latinos or Asian people can't access housing because they don't have the wealth to do that, right? So this is a bigger conversation that people are not taking into consideration the history of Minnesota when it comes to renters, right? Not wanting allowing people of color to live in certain neighborhoods. That should be part of the rent stabilization policy, allowing access for people to move and live wherever they want to. Because if you're living in the inner city, there's no wealth, you're not going to have any wealth, right? So if you go out there into the suburbs, they're going to discriminate against you because so you can't even live in those areas out there. So that's a deeper conversation with the government. That's a deeper conversation with the city council members to do their job to make sure people can afford to live where they live. Like, my last comment, when I came up here in 1980, rents weren't like this. I was telling Catherine, you could live anywhere you want to live, no matter what your income was, and live good. But today, that's not the case, and I think it's intentionally too, right? To move people out of their neighborhoods, and then where are they going to go? I just don't get that. People can't pay $2,000 rents when they don't even have access to a living wage. So I do see redlining, because I remember looking for houses with my boyfriend, and the houses that we looked at, they showed us buildings looked like they was condemned. And I asked the realtor, I'm like, where do you get that list from, off the condemned list? And then you want us to take another loan to fix this up? I'm like, I'm not doing it. So we still looking for property to own so we can help renters out. But still at the same time, though, we got to be realistic that we got to cap this rent so people can afford to buy them a home. Thank you for that beautiful presentation.
Can I add something really fast?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, in response to both what Claire was saying and Arlene's question, I think one response that I've heard from other planners and affordable housing providers in response to the mapping prejudice data is that this historical look like forces us all to ask the question, are we rhyming with history? I think that we can all look back at a policy like redlining or a policy like racial covenants and be like, that's crazy. That's really messed up that happened, and like feel very horrified about it. And I think that any policy that we see, whether it's the consolidation in the housing market or an inability of people of color to pay rent in the city, if we're going to look back 50 years later and say like, oh my God, we let that happen, we as a people let that happen, then that's something that we should like maybe all take pause about. I think any policy where you're seeing racial disparities in the outcomes are something we should be looking at really critically.
Catherine, hold on one second. Trupti, we're getting on the time that if we handle a couple more questions, we won't have a breakout group. I got a couple comments to me directly, which I just want to make sure that I include before I go to Kathleen. And then Trupti, you can let me know if you think we have time for a breakout room or if there's more comments and we should keep this open dialogue. Some of the questions that came to me, include like, is rent control the means responsible for fixing poverty, right? Because everyone, I got about gas prices, right? People need to go to work, so is that it? Should there be a minimum standard of living, right? If everyone gets a check, then you can afford your rent. So one of the questions is from developers is their department being singled out as this versus other things, as in food, transportation, in other ways. So that I did want to mention that because some people weren't comfortable saying it, but it's come up, and I know it's a much longer conversation. And Clara, I agree with you. It's a much bigger conversation here, and I'm trying to make sure that all the voices are heard. And one of the questions is rent control what's going to be the equalizer per se? People also need to invest in our education and all of our systems. So again, I keep wanting everyone to go back to the sheet that we made collectively on, keep that in mind, is what does a good policy look like? And I think everyone was in agreement that we had things on there. And so that should be the goal. Trupti, do you have anything to add before I go to Kathleen, Arlene, and then I think Clara had her hand up again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really up to you, Tony, just as a timing perspective, if we want to go to breakout rooms, if people would benefit from that. And it seems like that might be useful to do. So, Arlene, if it might be okay if we'll let Catherine speak and then maybe think about breakout rooms for 5-6 minutes. How do people feel about that? If you want to maybe just raise your hand real quick, that might let us know if that's, or if we should stay in big groups. So if you want to go to small group, just put a hand up and that gives us a sense of the room. If you want to stay in a large group, and we'll take Catherine's question now.
Rebecca, thank you so much for sharing with us. I always believe that if you want to know where you're going, you need to look back and see where you were. And I just want to make the statement that, not everybody's a capitalist and not everybody's interested in making a lot of wealth. So there's other lifestyles available. And so many people today are not able to afford a lifestyle that isn't making a lot of money or being even able to afford basic life necessities. So I just want to say that because I think we can get lost because we do have an economy of capitalism, but not everybody is a capitalist. And it's important to realize that a lot of people will rent happily for the rest of their life, but it has become unsustainable with where we are today. And I think that's why the people organized and voted to have some sort of regulation with rising rents. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed suggested we may be running out of time. I mean, we can either move away for 8 minutes, but then there's not going to be a lot of sharing. So I think I want to make the executive decision unless there is strong feedback that a couple other questions on here today. I know that Arlene had another question. Looks like Tony has a question. Malik had his hand up. Clara had her hand up. Cecile, we haven't heard from you in a while. So, so Arlene.
Yeah, I'm glad that there are other voices that are speaking up and that you're representing them, Tony. And I just wanted to say, rent stabilization isn't the be all and end all. I mean, it's not the magic bullet that is going to end poverty and all that, but it's certainly one of the things that can help because it does need a holistic thing with, transportation, education, even food and all of that kind of thing, and a living wage. All of those things need to happen. But here we're kind of putting our stake in the ground. This is something that we can do now to help people, find decent, affordable housing, rentals, and perhaps have the opportunity to save money, to build wealth so that they can buy a home. So, that would be my response. No, it's rent stabilization isn't going to be the thing that turns everything around for people who are in poverty or who are on the margins, but it's one step in the right direction along with other things that need to happen.
Thank you for that. I think it was very well said. This isn't the end all be all, but it can be a contributing factor. And so, I think that's what, for me, sharing this, it would be nice if if I'm being transparent, if there was information and data that I said, this is it. And it seems like I've seen data that supports the positive or the negative on rent control. I've seen data that says rents will go up with rent control. I've seen it that goes down. And I think this group has to really work hard and interpret the data the best they know how to make a healthy community. So, Tony?
Thank you, Tony. And Rebecca, that was a great presentation. I've seen this a couple of different times, and every time I see it, I pick up a new tidbit. And I agree with your comment about the fact that we can't look at ourselves 10 years from now and think about creating a policy that has unintended consequences and negatively impacts many in our community. The one thing I wanted to build off of the last conversation and piece by Catherine is that the capitalists are gone. The people that are true capitalists aren't part of this conversation. They aren't sticking around to see St. Paul be what St. Paul can be, because they don't want to operate in a regulated environment. And what I'm fearful of, I don't know if everyone saw the headline from the Pioneer Press today that apartment construction has dropped 80% in the city of St. Paul. That was the headline from today's paper. And it's true. Most of the people that want to work in a capitalist, unregulated area have left the market. And what I'm concerned about is that we won't have capital to construct new projects, and it will put pressure on the limited supply that we already have. And that will ultimately lead to gentrification that we are concerned about. And so for fear of unintended consequences, I want to make sure that what we're doing does not limit new supply to accommodate future growth in the city. And I'm fearful that the policy will have that impact. And therefore, because it exists, it will actually make things worse for our neighbors that need it the most.
Thank you for that. Clara, you had your hand up before and down.
No.
Go ahead, Clara.
I'm good, Tony.
Okay, Catherine?
Oh, me?
Your hand is up?
Oh, yes. Great. Thank you. I just wanted to respond to Tony. So first of all, I think we've already been told that new construction is out of the picture. So I don't think we have to worry about financing new construction. What we need to worry about is NOAA properties, naturally affordable properties, rental properties. And when we need to count on the citizens of St. Paul and the citizens of Minnesota to invest in these properties. We don't need investors. We need people that care about our city. And I think with rent stabilization and keeping things controlled, we will have housing that's affordable for everyone. So I disagree that we need foreign investors to come into our city. They're also the ones that are raising the prices of the properties that local citizens would buy, like for instance myself, and keep the properties up to date because I live right here in St. Paul, and would keep the rents lower so that my tenants stay in the properties longer. So, but I can't buy property right now because it's so expensive. And as more and more people from out of state come and buy with all their money, because they have more money because they live in states that, like Seattle, that pay a lot more money than we do here, then we get foreign investors, not people that care about St. Paul and the citizens of St. Paul.
Thank you for that. Cecile, last question, then I'm putting in the chat our meeting schedule. It's not pretty because of my writing, but Cecile, while you talk, I'll do that. Will you go ahead?
Yeah, so I really would urge you all, if you haven't read The Color Law, it's a really good book that really goes even deeper into what Rebecca was talking about. It's really, again, discouraging about our history. I will say, I haven't weighed in a whole lot here because we were given our marching orders at the very beginning that we have rent control. It's just, what is it going to look like? That's going to be an approach that, will help ensure some protection for tenants, but doesn't prevent landlords from being able to maintain their properties to get a return on investment. And I'll just say some of those unintended consequences, for example, affordable housing of what Common Bond does is not immune to this. So for example, we try to limit our rent increases to the extent that we can, but we are seeing some of our expenses go up exponentially that have nothing to do with this market. This is insurance. Our insurance has gone up like $40,000 on one property. Has nothing to do with our claims. It has to do with everything else that's going on across the market. We just got it slapped with a huge special assessment to improve a road. We don't have any way to pay for that except through rents. And our small landlords don't either. So I think, we still try to bifurcate this between landlords and our tenants. And I just think we have to be super open to understanding and ward off the unintended consequences that are going to have really negative impacts on landlords or on landlords like us that won't be able to provide quality, affordable housing. So there's got to be some balance in here. I'm not arguing against or for, I'm just saying this is not a simple exercise. And we really have to be really thoughtful about what the ultimate outcome to try to be as reasonable as possible to make sure that our housing is maintained well. Because I personally don't think it's a rent control issue. I do think it's an income issue, and it's a production issue. You know, it's the simple thing of supply and demand. If we don't have enough supply, rents are going to go up. That's just the way that is. But
so I think we can all agree that it's complicated, and we all agree that systemically, you know, racism is put us in this position we are today. I know, Kelly, you had your hand up, it's down, so I'm assuming that I can go on. I put the schedule in here. I really want people to go back and, you know, Trupti, maybe we can send it out. I mean, I thought it was a great exercise when we worked together looking at what a good policy would look like from different angles. And that should be the goal of this group. I mean, we should want everyone to be a winner. So there is going to be rent control. What is it going to look like? We put the values in there that we believe a good policy in. And so we really need to think when we talk about, is it a good policy for everybody and something that we're all willing to go forward with? So I know this is challenging. Cecile, thank you for your comments. You know, I understand that some of us have very strong opinions, and there is nothing wrong with strong opinions and what we believe in our own truth. So I want everyone to own that. I'd like to urge people to try to be empathetic to others and knowing that there's a lot of different, we're all sitting in different seats. But I think we put a group of values on there that we want this policy to look like. And I think that's what we want to work towards. Trupti, you want to close us off?
Yeah, so just there's no questions about the schedule. So in today's post meeting, I want to just let people know I'll send out schedule, I'll update meeting links, all of that business, and you'll be seeing that coming out in the next few days. So all of that will get updated correctly. And then I think one thing, just as a little bit as an observer and as a bystander, one of the things that what I've seen you guys be most effective is when you're thinking about how, you know. So as we get these results coming in the next few weeks, and we think about these different nuances of the different approach, you know, I'm reading a great book by Adam Grant about how we think. And one of these pieces is really about taking an idea and thinking about, as we think about these different policy implications, how is this going to affect the outcome? How is it going to meet the goals that we've defined together as a group, right? And really being evaluative about that process. So, and I think this other piece about Cecile talked about trying to separate out to two groups, you know, healthy discussion, healthy conflict. That's how we're going to get to the best resolutions, having this variety of viewpoints. This is a great group of people. And so I'm really excited and confident about like what you're going to be bringing to the discussions in the coming weeks. So, yeah.
So with that, thank you. We will look forward to seeing everyone at the public meeting. Look at your emails, and if you have comments or things that you didn't get to say, feel free to send them in the questionnaire afterwards. And thank you everyone for being a part of this. I know it hasn't been easy, but I did hear like people that are really invested in St. Paul are on here still. And that's most important.
Yes,
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone. Good job today. Beautiful presentation. Thank you, Tony.
Clara.
See you all.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Trumpy. I got 3 questions. You want me to email my answers to you?
You know what? Let me figure out how the best way to do that.
Okay.
But I've written them down. You've got 1, 2, and I think 10 were the ones that were missing for you, right?